Every year, millions of Americans file their tax returns paying their fair share to the IRS. But did you know there's a growing movement of people who believe you don't actually have to pay taxes? They argue that there's a legal way to opt out of paying income taxes, pointing to specific laws, definitions, and even the Constitution to make their case. They claim it's all about understanding the fine print, the true definitions, and your rights as a natural-born human. On the other hand, the IRS has a different perspective, seeing these arguments as nothing more than myths or frivolous attempts to sidestep the law. In this video, I'm not here to tell you what to believe. Instead, I'm going to take an objective, open-minded journey into this debate, exploring both sides of the argument. Can you really opt out of paying taxes, or is this just a risky interpretation of the law? Let's dive in together and find out. Hi, I'm Noel Lorenzana. I'm a CPA, I'm also an American, and I pay my taxes. I also prepare taxes for a living, so there's that. This video is for entertainment and informational purposes only. This is not tax, legal, or financial advice. Okay, so let's dive into the argument that you can legally opt out of paying taxes. At the heart of this belief is the idea that if you're not defined as a taxpayer by the government's standards or definition, you're not subject to the income tax laws. Sounds pretty interesting, right? Supporters of this argument say that the tax system only applies to those who fit the IRS's definition of a taxpayer. They claim that if you dig deep into legal definitions, you'll find that the tax laws might not actually apply to you as a natural-born citizen, or a natural-born human rather. Instead, they argue that these laws were written for specific entities like corporations or government employees. Let's go over some legal definitions and key laws cited. One of the most cited sections by this group is Title 26, United States Code 7806. They point to this code, which states that the provisions of the Internal Revenue Code shall not be given any legal effect simply based on their placement, title, or caption. For them, this means the entire tax code is more of a guideline than a strict law. However, in reality, the section is about interpreting the law based on its substance, not dismissing its authority. I'm not a lawyer, and this is just my understanding based on my limited research. I'll put it up on screen so that you can read it yourself. It's legalese and difficult to understand, and that contributes significantly to the confusion. Another common claim is that the U.S. Treasury can only accept voluntary gifts and bequests from the people based on Title 31, United States Code, Section 321, subsection D, paragraph 2. Some argue that this implies that taxes are voluntary contributions. To reinforce this belief, they often cite Title 18, United States Code 1584, which prohibits involuntary servitude, suggesting that paying taxes against your will could be seen as a form of involuntary servitude, something that would be against the Constitution. However, according to my findings, this interpretation has been repeatedly rejected by the courts, which have ruled that taxation is a lawful obligation, not involuntary servitude, even though it feels like that. You'll often hear opt-out supporters saying things like, I'm not a taxpayer as defined by law, so I don't have to file. Or, the IRS can't legally force me to pay because it's a violation of my rights. These statements reflect a genuine belief that the tax system doesn't apply to them, and they're certainly not alone in thinking this way. It's easy to see why this argument can be so enticing. After all, who wouldn't want to keep more of their hard-earned money? But before we jump to conclusions, let's take a closer look at how the IRS and the courts actually view these claims. Now that we've explored some of the ideas of opting out of taxes, let's look at how the IRS and the legal system respond to these arguments. Spoiler alert, they don't see it the same way. The IRS has made it clear that they consider the revocation of election that many argue will remove you from the voluntary tax system, and similar arguments, to be completely frivolous. According to them, there's no legal basis for opting out of paying taxes. In fact, they categorize these claims as frivolous tax arguments, which means they're seen as baseless, and without merit in the eyes of the law. According to the IRS, the claim that filing a tax return is voluntary is a misunderstanding. While the tax system allows taxpayers to calculate and report their own taxes, the obligation to file is mandatory, according to them. The word voluntary simply refers to the fact that taxpayers are responsible for determining their tax liability, rather than the government calculating it for them from the outset. The IRS points to specific sections of the law which establish that filing an income tax return is required for individuals who meet certain income thresholds. Treasury regulations like Section 1.6011-1, subsection A, further reinforces that the process is not optional. So from the IRS's point of view, while taxpayers have the responsibility to self-assess, the requirement to file and pay taxes is not voluntary. The IRS has actually prepared a very informative document that addresses many of what they describe as frivolous tax arguments. I'll post the full PDF in the description and in the comments. In the IRS's publication, they address each of these arguments in detail. For example, as already mentioned, they refute the idea that paying taxes is voluntary, explaining that while the system allows for self-assessment, the obligation to pay taxes is very much a legal requirement. They even go as far as to issue warnings about the consequences of using these arguments. The IRS can impose penalties of up to $5,000 for filing a frivolous tax return, and they've been known to pursue criminal charges against those who persist in these claims. Let's look at some others. Contention: taxpayer is not a person as defined by the Internal Revenue Code, thus is not subject to federal income tax laws. According to the IRS, some individuals and groups maintain that they are not a person as defined by the Internal Revenue Code, and thus not subject to federal income tax laws. The IRS says this argument is based on a misunderstanding of the code. They say, according to the law, the Internal Revenue Code clearly defines person and sets forth which persons are subject to federal taxes. Section 7701, subsection A, paragraph 14, defines taxpayer as any person subject to any internal revenue tax, and Section 7701, subsection A, paragraph 1, defines person to include an individual, trust, estate, partnership, or corporation. Arguments that an individual is not a person within the meaning of the Internal Revenue Code have been uniformly rejected. A similar argument with respect to the term individual has also been rejected. The IRS warned taxpayers of the consequences of making this frivolous argument in Revenue Ruling 2007-22, found in the 2007 IRS Bulletin, Volume 1, page 866. In their frivolous tax guide, they also cite numerous case law to support this. Let's look at another one. Contention: taxpayer is not a citizen of the United States and thus is not subject to federal income tax laws. According to the IRS, some people argue that by rejecting U.S. citizenship in favor of state citizenship, they believe they are no longer obligated to pay federal income taxes. Another version of this argument is that an individual claims they are a free-born citizen of a particular state and were never a citizen of the United States to begin with. The general idea here is that only U.S. citizens are subject to federal tax laws, so by rejecting U.S. citizenship, they believe they are exempt. According to the IRS, however, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution clearly defines U.S. citizenship. It states that anyone born or naturalized in the United States is a citizen of both the United States and the state in which they reside, meaning that federal and state citizenship are simultaneous. The courts have consistently rejected claims that individuals can be state citizens but not U.S. citizens in order to avoid federal taxes. The IRS has also issued warnings about the consequences of making this argument, referencing legal rulings. Let's look at one last one. Contention: the United States consists only of the District of Columbia, federal territories, and federal enclaves. Some claim that the United States is made up of only specific federal areas like the District of Columbia, D.C., federal territories such as Puerto Rico and Guam, and certain federal enclaves, including military bases and American Indian reservations. They argue that because they don't live in these states, but rather in a sovereign state, they are not subject to federal tax laws. The IRS's position is that the Internal Revenue Code applies to all U.S. citizens and residents, regardless of where they live, and not just to those of the District of Columbia or federal territories. The Supreme Court has affirmed that the 16th Amendment allows a federal income tax to be applied to U.S. citizens nationwide, not just in those federal areas. Court cases such as United States versus Collins have rejected these claims. The IRS also warned taxpayers about the consequences of making this argument, referencing rulings such as Revenue Ruling 2006-18. And it's not just the IRS that takes these arguments seriously. The courts have consistently ruled against individuals who attempt to use the opt-out or revocation of election defenses. For example, in United States versus Jared's, the court stated that the claim that payment of federal income tax is voluntary is without merit. In United States versus Schiff, a well-known tax protester was sentenced to over 12 years in prison for promoting the idea that paying taxes was voluntary. So while it might seem like there's room for debate, the reality is that the IRS and the courts have been very clear. These arguments don't hold up in legal proceedings, and there can be severe consequences for trying to rely on them. So why do so many people believe they can legally opt out of paying taxes, even when the IRS and the courts say otherwise? The answer often comes down to misunderstandings and misinterpretations of the tax code and legal definitions. One of the biggest sources of confusion is the idea that the U.S. tax system is voluntary. Supporters of the opt-out argument often point to phrases like this, claiming that since it's voluntary, you can simply choose not to participate. But when the IRS says voluntary, they mean that taxpayers are responsible for calculating and reporting their own taxes, not that paying taxes is optional. In reality, if you meet certain income thresholds, the law requires you to file a return and pay your taxes. Another common misunderstanding is the focus on definitions. For example, some argue that if they don't identify as a taxpayer, then they're not subject to tax laws. But in legal terms, a taxpayer is simply anyone subject to an internal revenue tax, which includes just about anyone with income. And when it comes to terms like income, some believe that only certain types of earnings are taxable, or that wages from labor actually aren't income. But according to the tax code, income means all income from any source derived, including wages, salaries, or other forms of compensation. It's broad and it's meant to be that way. So why do these arguments persist despite clear laws and court rulings? There's more to this debate than just legal definitions. For a lot of people, the idea of opting out of taxes is incredibly appealing. Let's face it, taxes can be a huge financial burden, and it's easy to feel like you're giving up a big chunk of your hard-earned money. It's not hard to see why the thought of keeping more of what you earn and why not having to pay taxes at all can be tempting. And when someone offers a legal-sounding argument that seems to back up that idea, it can feel like they've discovered a secret that the rest of us don't know about. Then there's the broader movement of what's known as sovereign citizens, people who believe that they're outside of the jurisdiction of federal and state governments. This movement often overlaps with the tax opt-out arguments, fueling the idea that individuals can declare themselves exempt from tax laws. It's a complex mix of financial frustration, distrust in government, and a desire for autonomy that keeps this debate alive. But does that mean these arguments really hold up in reality? Let's keep going and see if there's any real evidence that you can legally opt out of paying taxes. We've heard some of the claims and counterclaims. So what's the objective reality here? Can you truly opt out of paying taxes, or is it just wishful thinking? Let's break it down. On one side, supporters of the opt-out argument point to definitions and legal codes insisting that the IRS lacks the authority to enforce income tax laws on natural-born citizens who haven't explicitly agreed to be taxed. They believe that without their consent, they're not bound by the tax code. But on the other side, the IRS, backed by the power to seize your assets, put you in jail, and decades of court rulings, maintain that the tax code applies to everyone who earns income within the United States of America, whether they like it or not. The courts have consistently ruled that arguments about opting out or revoking one's taxpayer status simply don't hold water. So let's talk about risks versus rewards. On one hand, if the opt-out argument were valid, the potential reward is obvious. You might avoid paying thousands, hundreds of thousands in taxes. But what if you're wrong? The risks are serious. Hefty fines, penalties, interest on unpaid taxes, and even potential jail time. The IRS has shown that it's more than willing to pursue people who challenge the system, often with severe consequences. It's understandable why some people might feel tempted to try, but as we've seen, the legal system is firmly against these arguments. The IRS isn't likely to change its stance anytime soon, and the courts have shown little patience for what they consider frivolous tax positions. The reality is, no matter how convincing some of these arguments might seem, they come with substantial risks. And while it's always good to question authority and understand your rights, it's just as important to recognize when an argument is more wishful thinking than legal fact. At the end of the day, whether you agree with the tax laws or not, they're the rules we live under. But I encourage you to keep asking questions, keep researching, and always seek out reliable professional advice when it comes to matters as serious as this. We've covered a lot today, from the idea that you can legally opt out of paying taxes to how the IRS and courts view these claims and why the debate continues to draw so much attention. So where do we go from here? It's clear that the argument for opting out of taxes taps into a real desire for financial freedom and autonomy. And who wouldn't want to believe there's a way to keep more of their hard-earned money? But as we've seen, the legal reality tells a different story. Courts have consistently ruled against these arguments, and the IRS takes tax compliance very seriously. If you're someone who's considering the revocation of election path or any other tax avoidance strategy, I urge you to consult with a qualified legal advisor. It's important to understand the potential risks involved and to make informed decisions based on facts, not just what you might read or hear online, this video included. Trust me, I'd love to find a way to avoid paying taxes too. I think we all feel like we pay too much, but at the end of the day, taxes are what keep the country running. Now, please don't shoot the messenger. I'm just here to present a balanced and hopefully objective point of view. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Have you come across these arguments before? Do you think there's truth to them, or are they just wishful thinking? Now, I just want to add one other thing. I work for myself. I don't work for the IRS. I don't have any hidden agendas. You might think I'm pushing an agenda, and that's fine. That's fair. You can have that opinion. But also keep in mind, there are actors out there, maybe bad actors, let's call them, who are pushing this agenda of being able to opt out of paying taxes. Maybe they're profiting from it. Maybe they're selling a book or a course. But at the end of the day, do they offer you a guarantee that their system or their tax avoidance strategy will work? Probably not. And if you still disagree, let me know in the comments how you have successfully avoided taxes. I've yet to see a solid, comprehensive strategy or evidence that supports the opt-out strategy. So if you have one, let me know in the comments. I'm all ears. If you found this video insightful, I'd really appreciate it if you could give the video a like and consider subscribing to stay connected. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you in another video.